Thank you very much, Gabriel. That reminds me to point out before I say another word to everyone that this seminar is going to be recorded. It's going to be put onto the Institute of African Studies website for public use, hopefully for people to use as discussions in their classes, or if they're just interested in going back to the discussion once they've read the book. So I have to let you know that, so you know that whatever you say will be recorded. I don't ever anticipate that anyone will be abusive, so I don't think we need to worry in our seminar about that. Julie, I'll answer that question in a minute. I want to welcome all of you again to the second in this year's series. Last week, 2 weeks ago, we had Hugo Canham's amazing book, Riotous Deathscapes, and a fabulous conversation with Ronaldo Walcott to kick us off. And I feel like I'm just floating on the same high, having read the book we're about to discuss today. But let me just say I'm Shireen Hassim, for people who don't know me. I'm the Canada 150 Research Chair in Gender and African Politics here at Carleton University in the Institute of African Studies. We are located on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. We are always mindful in our seminar of the extent to which we share certain kinds of colonial histories across spaces in Africa and Turtle Island, and that we attempt to make conversations between those to show what is common about our experience, but also often what is different in our experiences, and how together we might challenge hierarchies of power. In the Knowing Africa series, we are trying to position Africa as a place, not only a place that one ought to know about, but as a place that is a space of knowing of itself, of theory making about itself and about the world. And that's really the sort of central driver. So what I try to do in the series is bring to your notice, or to everybody's notice, books that I have read and loved, and I think that everybody should be reading from and about Africa, mostly from Africa, and always in conversation between these spaces I am in, which are in both Canada and South Africa. So welcome everyone to this week's discussion. I'm so delighted to welcome all of you, but especially Siphokazi Magadla, who is a professor of political science. Well, the few times we have a political scientist in the room, and one of the very few feminist political scientists in Africa, one of the very few Black women political scientists, but the numbers are growing, I'm glad to say. Professor Magadla is also chair of political science and international relations at the university currently known as Rhodes University, and she has been working on this book for a while, but she is also a very active convener of conversations herself. In discussion with her, we have two old friends to this Knowing Africa seminar series, Pumla Dineo, Gqola, who has been a discussant and spoken about her book in our series, Rape, a South African Nightmare. Many will remember as her great intervention in debates, and she's recently been awarded the Falling Walls Fellowship Distinctive Prize for that work. Rachel Sandwell, and she is the South African Research Chair in African Feminist Imagination, which has to be the best name for a chair ever. So welcome, Pumla from Port Elizabeth. Or Nelson, I don't, Canberra, where are you? East London, actually, right? It was where you physically located. And yes, then we have, sorry?
Sorry, I thought you were asking me a question.
No, yeah, I was.
Yes, I'm based in Gqola, but I'm currently in East London.
Okay.
East London, South Africa, not East London, UK.
We can live in many places at once, I have learned. And then we have Rachel Sandwell, who also was a discussant in a previous round of the Knowing Africa seminar. Rachel is an assistant professor of history at Cornell University, having abandoned Canadian academia for our big bad neighbor down south. Rachel recently moved to Cornell. Congratulations, Rachel. And we are very happy to welcome her back to discuss Siphokazi's book, which is, in fact, in the exact field of research that Rachel's own book, which she is finalizing, will be, and we will all soon read it, and we hope to invite you back, Rachel, as author very soon. So welcome to everyone who is here. The way we do this is that the author gets a chance to present the main ideas of their book, and then we'll have comments from Pumla and Rachel, and then I will open it up for a general discussion and questions from all of you, which you can unmute yourselves and ask, preferably so that we have some humanizing element to the Zoom platform. But if you can't, for whatever reasons, including, I know, for people based in Africa, data scarcity makes it difficult to do that sometimes. Feel free to put your questions in the Q&A and I will try and field them for the authors. And do feel free to introduce yourselves on the chat. Before I hand over to Siphokazi, I just want to say that one of my great sadnesses about this book and the book we are going to be discussing next week, The Blinded City by Matthew Wilhelm Solomon, is that it's still the case that distribution networks for South African and African books are very poor in global terms. So it's very easy for people. I know people who are based in South Africa have the book Siphokazi, but others based around the world still don't have it. Hopefully that glitch will be resolved very soon. But so I'm really sorry to say we can't immediately say go to Amazon as we usually do and post the link. It is available from the University of KwaZulu-Natal Press, though postage fees are often exorbitant. I would advise you to look there. So, Siphokazi, let me hand it over to you, Professor Magadla.
Thank you very much, Shireen. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about this book. Thank you to you and your team, Shika and Gabriel, and thank you to the discussants, Pumla and Rachel. I really appreciate that you took the time to read this book. It's not something that I take for granted. So I'm going to just speak to the book in terms of how the chapters appear. I'm going to try to also read some quotes from some of the 40 women whose lives I write about, just to show the cover for the South African version of Guerrillas and Combative Mothers. And the Routledge version of the book will be out on the 1st of December for our colleagues in Canada, the US, and elsewhere. It is a bit pricey, but I'm hoping that you can buy at least the ebook version. So really, in a nutshell, the book looks at the role of women in a particular period of South African history from 1961 to 1994. What happens after the Sharpeville massacre in 1960 is that the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress, the PAC, they are banned. What this does is to surface conversations that some trace for the ANC from the 1940s to the 1950s about arms strategy as one of the pillars of the anti-apartheid struggle. So as the national liberation movements make sense of what it means now to operate fully in the underground, they decide from 1961 to adopt strategy. And this is after, for the ANC, 50 years of their commitment to nonviolence. What the book tries to do is to make sense of what this meant for women, what they thought of the shift in terms of the tactics for the ANC and what was then a new party, the PAC, how they are politicized, and some of the specific moments that define their decision to choose armed strategy as the way in which they were going to contribute to national liberation. So the book is made up of 40 life histories. These are interviews from 2010 to 2019. 22 women of Umkhonto weSizwe, the armed wing of the ANC, 8 women from what was then Poqo, what became APLA, the Azanian People's Liberation Army, which is the armed wing of the PAC, and 12 women who fought along a self-defense unit called Amabuto in Port Elizabeth, what is now Gqeberha, one of the what are known as paramilitary forces that emerged in the 1980s at the height of the township violence in South Africa. The first chapter really foregrounds the public moments where MK women have complained about the silence about their role in armed struggle historiography. And it really shows that there's a silence about what women did during the armed struggle in both public culture as well as in academic literature, because I make the argument that there is a booming industry of anti-apartheid literature, especially in terms of memoirs and biographies, but very few are by women or about women. When women appear in public culture, often the debate is around whether or not they were only victims of sexual violence in the military camps of MK. And I show how they have responded to this to this narrowing of their role. And really what the book does, especially when I look at what women in MK did in the camps in Angola, is to try to show the shifts that happened from the 1960s, but more so from the 1970s, when you have a bigger number of women, especially young women, who leave South Africa after the 1976 Soweto uprisings. So the increase in the numbers of women changes the institutional culture of Umkhonto weSizwe, but it also gives room to raise questions about gender equality. So for one, MK has to respond to the fact of having bodies of women that need pads, that need contraception, so reproductive questions are raised. And this also raises questions of leadership. And what I try to map up in terms of really dividing the experiences of women from the 1970s and the 1980s for MK women is to show that some of the changes we see in terms of questions of gender equality, in terms of women's leadership or even reproductive access, this shift in terms of time, and much of that, the changes that we see in the 1980s are a result of the agitation of the women from the 1970s. And so why you have women who join in the 1980s who say, I was in a camp, I was one of 5 women in a camp with 400 to 500 men, but I was never harassed. I make the argument that a lot of that is because of what women who came earlier in the 1970s had done to create a condition, create an institutional culture where women could imagine themselves as combatants in the specific case of Angola. And this is why Ambassador Tendrim Ditso makes this point, and I open the book with this quote. She says, are there contradictions between being a woman and being a soldier? Are we soldiers or are we women, or women soldiers? But it doesn't apply for me. They are just soldiers. We were not just supporters. We were and will remain combatants of Umkhonto weSizwe in whatever strengths or weaknesses. MK over time also became less patriarchal. If you look at MK in its last days, and I was one of those in its last days in Uganda. So this is the point I make around the importance of looking at times and the questions that become possible, as well as the structural and ideological changes. I also look at the role that excites a lot of students around women in combat. So the thing with women in MK especially is that there's no contestation that they received the same military training as men, but there is a contestation about whether or not they really fought in direct combat. And what I show there is that two things can be possible. So MK women resisted being called women soldiers, as Mtitso shows. But what I show is that how they were deployed in combat, their deployment really rested in the use of their military training, but also a dynamic use of their femininity. I really try to show this through the specific role that women played in MK's last military operation, which is Operation Gqola. So I make that point that it is true, they received the same military training, but femininity still mattered in how they were deployed in combat. This builds on the work of people like Raymond Satner. It also builds in the arguments that Shireen has made about how women said they could easily operate in the underground because no one assumed them to be combatants. Then in the follow, so I map out the daily life in Angola, these experiences of combat, but also, some of the questions around the use of torture in the camps in MK. While this was not a big focus of the study, it does come up. And what I say is that future work will still tell us about what was the role of figures such as Ruth Mompati in some of these controversies that we see especially in the 1980s with the mutiny that happens in Angola. The following chapter then looks at the role of women that remained in South Africa, because one of the things that I argue is that while it is maybe seductive to assume that most women participated in the armed struggle through military training, through guerrilla training in exile, in actual fact, MK women are the exception. They are not the rule. The majority of women in South Africa participated in the armed struggle without military training. They also participated in South Africa, in fact, inside South Africa. And what I do is to go back to 1960, looking at the role of women of Poqo in what is known as in the Poqo insurrections of the 1960s, what women did fighting against Bantu authority, specifically in the Transkei, which was the first homeland to accept Bantu authority. It is to move against the erasure of women's role in those early stages of the PAC's very specific and rural-based military action. I then moved to the 1980s, looking at the role of the self-defense units and how women who were active in the civic movements, who were aligned with the UDF, were key in supporting young men and women in the military actions of the 1980s. And in many ways, I agree with the argument you've made, Shireen, about what the role of women in the 1980s really shows the combination of political tradition and militancy. So the women that I spoke to, they were aligned to the UDF. So they had a specific ideological and political orientation in their participation. And so I map out how the space of the school, the home, the churches becomes reconfigured towards the support of this military action. And I also look at the role of young women, because when we speak about this history, we talk about the young lions, assuming that young women were not there. So I look at their role and I see really try to illuminate the intersection between what older and young women did at this time and what space made possible. Then chapter 4, I hope I'm doing okay with time. I'm doing fine, okay. The fourth chapter looks at what happens in the aftermath. And here I wanted to read a quote by Cynthia Enloe. In fact, maybe I can just go back a bit since I'm doing okay with time, to speak about some of these important moments that women speak to in terms of how they made a decision to join the armed struggle. And here I want to read a quote by Makhosazana Xaba. And she says, "I can point to a date. On the 29th of October, 1983, members of Inkatha, Impi, came to university at Ongoye. By the end of that day, 4 students had died and 1 other person. I made the decision on that day I will be looking to join. I was never recruited to MK. On that day, I decided I will ask people until somebody tells me who to talk to. That's how I joined MK. Nobody was looking to recruit me, but that event, when men who looked like me came and killed us on our campus, we were university students. I mean, I was much older. I had finished a degree. I'd finished a diploma. I was in my 20s. But university students, they are 19, 18, 20, and they came, and these are Black men. That, for me, changed a lot of what was in my head, because I wasn't sacrificing myself. It was self-preservation, because what I realized on that day is that if I don't do something to know how to kill and fight back, I'll die, and that would be for me a failure on my part. Not to have armed myself when experience has shown me that I need to be ready to fight and die fighting. I did not want to die not fighting. So for me, it's a story that I can pin to a date when the shift of my activism moved from just being a student movement and, doing women's work here and there. And so I also want to do the same thing about the chapter on combative motherhood, really situating some of these moments for women. I read Xaba's quote because this year marks the 40th anniversary of the Ongoye massacre. And when she was at Rhodes University last year receiving an honorary doctorate, she asked if what the public conversations would be to mark this moment. And she was correct that not much has been said about the Ongoye massacre that happened in 83. So the quote I wanted to read about combative motherhood is one from the recently late Zoleka Mandela. She says in her book, When Hope Whispers, "By the time I was born on 9 April 1980, my mother knew how to strip and assemble an AK-47 in exactly 38 seconds. The next one I want to read is by Bale Gambete, who is the subject of some of Rachel's writing. She says, "I remember an early morning before I went into exile, very early morning. My son was on the breast, but as a comrade arrived, it was after 4 o'clock in the morning because we had to go somewhere. That was the reality of underground work. I had to pull my son from my breast. I'll never forget the feeling of him holding onto my breast, holding into my nipple, and me pulling him out of the breast, pulling him away from my nipple, and knowing that actually I was unlikely ever to bring him back to that breast, and that was that." So the chapter then I also wanted to talk about is that I try to track women's experiences of the integration process, because what happens after, as part of the negotiation process, is the amalgamation or the integration of 7 armies into what is currently the South African National Defence Force. So I try to center women's experiences in that process, trying to understand why some of them chose to stay as soldiers, and the reason some of them chose not to do so. Some of them say, we were political soldiers. They didn't imagine careers in the Defence Force. For them, armed struggle was part of a political strategy towards a specific effort. And when apartheid ended, that goal had been achieved. So they could begin to dream new dreams and paint out new careers for themselves. But I look at how women's experiences is similar to that of men who feel that the armed wings of the liberation movements were really assimilated into the logic of the old apartheid South African Defence Force. So I do that, and then I also look at the specific role that MK women played in attempting to facilitate the gender transformation within the South African Defence Force, because in fact, the highest ranked woman in the SANDF came from MK. So one of them I interviewed is Jackie Sedibe, and she talks about how she made sure that she was not going to be the only Major General in the SANDF. I talked to another chief of the Director of Transformation, as well as the current Minister of Defence Force, who was at that time in Parliament, to look at how women really worked at various levels within the SANDF, but also worked in Parliament to create the legislative infrastructure that would make it possible for a new generation of women to imagine a career in the SANDF. In fact, the former EFF parliamentarian Linshol Chabalala, she makes the argument that it is MK women who liberated white women even in the SANDF, because they brought this this experience from exile, where they were trained with men and felt that women deserved to participate in all the areas of the new democratic military. The final chapter looks at what these women do after 1994, and I really use Professor Gqola's concept of the new South African woman, because Jacqueline Koch makes the point in Kernels and Cadres that the image of the woman guerrilla is a source of inspiration, an image of a liberated woman, but the new South African woman is not quite the image of that guerrilla woman. She is more corporatized, as Gqola described. She is a particular kind of femininity. And I make the point that some of the women guerrillas who become ambassadors, some of them become CEOs, can be said maybe to fit that image of the new South African woman. But in the main, the women guerrillas really feel that they are misfits. Some of them, they say, I almost got into a fight with my ex-husband where we were almost shooting each other, and our families couldn't handle that. They couldn't handle this very masculine woman. So the experience of South African women is very similar to others in the region, in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, in Namibia, where the guerrilla woman is seemed to be too tough for the newly liberated country. But in the main, I make the point that women combatants, whether they were trained in exile or inside, they are hustlers like other South African women. Most of them, they are breadwinners, they are poor, they have to make ends meet for their families. So there's nothing fundamentally different from in terms of their economic status. I think maybe let me stop there by reading a final quote from Thandi Modise in the concluding chapter, where their seed can fall and grow. She says, after all, these flowers of the nation are not being left on the table in a vase. After all, these flowers of the nation are beginning to be put on the ground, where their seed can fall and grow. Because if you put the flowers of the nation in a vase, you actually ensure that they wither away and they are forgotten. Thanks.
Wonderful quote to end with. Thank you so much. Rachel, I'll hand over to you.
Perfect. So thank you so much. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to be here discussing this wonderful book in such good company. So I'm going to make some remarks about what I see as the most sort of striking contributions of this book, and I will pose some questions throughout for the author, but I'll repeat them at the end too for simplicity. So the book, Guerrillas and Combative Mothers by Siphokazi and Magadla, offers a much needed and convincing corrective to work on the armed struggle in South Africa, which still tends to exclude women and ignore their contributions. Using a powerful array of oral history interviews with past combatants, Magadla demonstrates incontrovertibly that women were present throughout the struggle and that their presence matters. But this book doesn't just add in women. It asks us to think about the gendering of the struggle and how we see South Africa's years of armed conflict differently when we include gender. This book engages in sustained dialogue with existing research in South Africa on women and gender in South Africa's liberation movements, but it is, as the author says, the first book-length consideration of women's roles across the multiple movements, the multiple armed movements who operated during the apartheid period, and importantly, of women's experiences in the aftermath of the armed struggle years. So let me comment now on three aspects that really stood out to me as I read this book. So first, the book considers women across what we could call the anti-apartheid movements. Previous literature, as Magadla points out, has disproportionately focused on the ANC and on MK. To correct this imbalance, this book includes experiences of women combatants from the PAC and the ZAPO. This is really striking material. For the 1960s period, for example, it's been a foregone conclusion that the PAC was a heavily masculinized formation and women are not involved. This book breaks really new ground in presenting interviews with women who fought with the PAC's armed wing in the 1960s with Poko, especially in rural areas. And rural areas too have been so often left out of existing work on the armed struggle. Equally, the book includes interviews with women who were active in Azapo's armed wing in the 1980s. The result is a book that for the first time considers women's militant roles across a wide range of anti-apartheid organizations, looking at commonalities they shared, an important contribution. So in taking this approach, the book makes what I think is an interesting and effective methodological choice. Rather than categorizing women and their experiences on the basis of their political formation, it broadly divides their experiences between exiles and those who stayed inside the country. The focus on the type of engagement enables the book to delve into detail on women's motivations, on their agency as they chose whether or not to go into exile, whether or not or how and why to involve themselves in struggle, like in the example you just gave of Bakosazada Taba's contribution or choices. But in reading it, I had two questions that occurred to me. First, I would love to hear about how you found these women, especially those from the lesser known traditions, especially those PAC women. This is just my historian's curiosity. But secondly, I would like to hear more about how you arrived at the decision to treat the women from different formations together, although their politics at times disagreed. So your book so richly details these women's shared commitments to opposing apartheid and their gendered experience of that struggle, but it doesn't address as much why they chose which movement at which time and how. So I'm curious to hear more about your authorial choice there, especially since I know so many women in the ANC at various times quite adamantly opposed the PAC and rejected those politics. So did women in your interviews mention their choice to be PAC versus ANC, or was it just not a major concern in the interviews? Was this direction simply less pertinent for your overall focus of women's gendered experience of combat? So secondly, the methodological choice to divide women into transnational versus internal fighters enables what I see as a powerful expansion of the category of combatant, as you argue so well throughout. So throughout the chapters on women's fighting experience and on demobilization, this book insists that we must take women in community struggles as combatants as well, not only women who've joined formal military units. I think this is a really sound strategy. As you say, the apartheid state, through its accelerating violence and militarization of society, I quote here, erased the lines between civil and military and attacked all those who opposed it, however they opposed it, right? So this innovation is significant because it dramatically expands for you the number of women you could include in this study, not just the official soldier women. As more women were involved in community mobilizations than were ever in the official military organizations. So I think this shift also, or this shift of focus also enables a move away from what we could call top-down or organizational histories of the specific movements to more grassroots or experiential histories of people who participated in anti-apartheid resistance. So a strength of this approach is the wider lens, the inclusion of a more diverse set of participants, and a more comprehensive accounting of the range of people who involved in and the methods they used to fight back against apartheid. Although, again, a possible loss is a focus or decreased attention on what we could call political or even sort of sectarian differences. This expansion of the combatant category leads me to another question, which is a very historian's question, so I feel a little apologetic posing it. So the book basically takes its start from the formal declaration of armed struggle by the ANC in 1961, or by first MK and later claimed by the ANC. But throughout, the material so effectively challenges the hegemony of the ANC's claim over the armed struggle. And equally, many of the women's movements, especially the rural movements you talk about, predate 61. So can you say a little more about your chronological focus and sort of how you decided on temporalizing the category of the woman combatant? So finally, I want to turn to the idea of gendering and gendering the armed struggle. And I must say that here, I think this book offers a real masterclass in going beyond adding women to really considering the gendered implications of women's presence and participation. In doing so, it makes remarkable use of the oral histories that you've collected, which are so compelling, really demonstrating just how important oral history is as a tool for capturing experiences otherwise excluded from sort of conventional historical sources. So a few key elements really stood out for me here. Number one, you make, as you made also in your introduction here, I think the analytical point that there's been a disproportionate focus on sexual violence within MK and within MK's camps in particular, right? So the book in no way disputes that sexual violence occurred or that it needs to be reckoned with, but the book powerfully suggests that the tendency to assume that discussions about gender in MK must automatically be about sexual violence has obscured other aspects of women's gendered experience in the camps. So one of your interviewees gave a very moving example of the sort of other types of gendering that we need to think about. The woman in the interview recalled that when women were first in the camps, they had no proper underwear. The male comrade said to buy the underwear was too embarrassed to buy women's underwear, so he just bought men's underwear for everyone. So women were all having to be there wearing men's underwear. It's a recollection that's at once very sweet and sad. It's poignant. It encapsulates so quickly or so thoroughly masculine anxiety, women's shared marginalization and frustration. And also, as you point out, something changed, right? Later, women in MK had proper underwear. In a banal and quotidian way, the ANC's military got better at acknowledging that women were also present, equal, but not always entirely the same. With insightful discussions like these, the book adds new evidence to a claim that scholars have made before, that MK became, rather surprisingly, a site for the advancement of women. And it also insists that we take seriously women's experiences as women within MK. This leads to a second point where gendered analysis is so profoundly helpful in the book's discussion of demobilization and integration of MK and other formations into the South African military after 1994. This is a remarkable contribution of the book, bridging experiences under apartheid with the post-apartheid period, and providing a really fine-grained discussion of what actually happened to combatant women once the combat ended or was supposed to have ended. The book includes a diversity of opinions from former combatants who described how they navigated their choice of whether or not to integrate into the military, an option that was at least technically or formally open, although you discussed the many barriers, to members of defined military anti-apartheid organizations, women combatants in the wider sense who were involved in community organizations or mobilizations were excluded from the get-go from this option, as the book discusses. For those who could choose to enter the post-apartheid military, they encountered a variety of obstacles. Some of these were common with male combatants, such as the devaluation of guerrilla military experience and particular skills in non-traditional combat, the unreformed racism of the South African military apparatus, which had the right to examine and evaluate them, and rigid military hierarchies, which some experienced as sharply different from the more open and dynamic MK space. But for women, there was the added burden of the fact that the military was also deeply sexist. While women had fought alongside men in the anti-apartheid organizations, the South African military under apartheid really marginalized even white women, like most militaries in the world. Some women, that's what Magadla demonstrates, entered and challenged the military's sexism post-apartheid with some significant victories, but others chose not to or were marginalized despite their wishes to integrate. Those who chose to demobilize were supposed to receive special support from the state. And here, the book's testimony provides a really powerful demonstration of how specifically women were marginalized from that support that was supposed to be there for them. Access to the support often depended on who the women knew, being connected to the right people, and because decision-making has been consolidated in Pretoria, people had to travel to appointments. The book really successfully demonstrates that this was a factor that disproportionately marginalized and harmed women, as they were more likely to face obstacles to travel, such as family responsibilities. I found myself very moved by the interviewees in this section who seemed to call on you specifically to help them out, seeking additional support, which leads me to ask, do you see or would you hope for really specific policy implications for this work? So now I'll turn to my full list of questions. I'll pose 2 new questions, and I'll also repeat the ones that I sort of sprinkled throughout. So first, I wanted to ask more methodologically about oral history. As I said, this book relies on these really, I think, compelling and remarkable oral history interviews. They're a really fantastic resource, and the book develops them so well. I would love to hear more just about how you found the interviewees in general, especially these more sort of hard to reach women, but really all of them. And also, what was that process, seeking the women, finding them and connecting with them, like for you as an author? And was there anything that particularly surprised you as you moved through that process? And second, I wanted to ask about the photographs. The book contains a really beautiful series of very moving photographs. They're just absolutely compelling to sort of sit and leaf through. So I would love to hear more about how you chose the particular images that you use. And then to summarize what I asked before, what guided your decision to focus less on women's political differences and more on their shared experiences, in terms of including in the same terms women who are members of different or even opposed political formations? And how did you decide on the start date of the early 1960s? And do you see or hope for policy implications from this study? So in conclusion, thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss and read in depth this great book.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was fantastic. Pumla, I'm going to ask you to please make your comments.
Thank you, Shireen, and thank you, Rachel. Good evening, everybody who's joined. And thank you again, Shireen, for the opportunity to really sit with and reflect on the valuable contribution of Siphokazi Magadla's Guerrillas and Combative Mothers, Women and the Armed Struggle in South Africa. A scholarly text that takes upon itself some serious definitional work on the very articulations of armed struggle, on the urgency of rigor when we reflect on women's historic agency and their negotiation of complex, violent terrain, and the strategic postures adopted by women in defining the terms of their participation in combative action. Taking on the full period of armed struggle, 1961, roughly, to 1994, from the onset, Magadla quickly, I'm going to address her in the third person, even though she's here, just because that's how I wrote it and it's easier. Magadla quickly dispenses with many ostensibly commonsensical associations with armed struggle. Her extensive interviews are with women trained in guerrilla warfare as conventionally understood, women who took up and or facilitated other forms of violent insurrections, women located in urban, township, self-defense and Amamuto units, and women in the 1960s rural uprisings variously defined. Her definition of the terrain disrespects the conventional biases of urban-rural divisions between formally trained and untrained. She complicates the overlapping and distinct entries into armed combat as girls, younger women, older women, and what this means differently, as she has several of her interviewees speak about what it means to join as a girl rather than as a much older woman. In camps and other exilic spaces, and disruptively across political parties, as well as inside the country. Sorry, I missed that part. This is no small matter given the contestations that have haunted South Africa's entire 3 decades of post-apartheid official memory. The book is refreshingly free of the hang-ups of contestatory patriarchal ownership of nationalism that plague the ways in which the Freedom Project is narrated. And I'm including here contestations around which liberation movement has prominence and how this should be supplemented, all of which in the main continue to circulate and to be staged in patriarchal discourse, taking for granted the place of men of different movements. The book is refreshingly free of these hang-ups of contestatory patriarchal ownership of nationalism that plague the ways in which the Freedom Project is narrated. There's much, I felt, to be learned from Magadla's capacity to face real differences within the left. And here, I'm not just talking about the familiar generalized PAC, BC, ANC memory contestations about the narration of anti-apartheid heroic action, but Magadla goes much further to name and include women's insurrection under the off-silence, violent exchanges between places in the West, in the left. I think in many ways it's often easier to speak about when you're talking about violence between different Black groups in apartheid. It's very often easier to narrate. It has been easier to narrate and to pay attention, although pay attention to conflict between the IFP and different positions within the left.
Okay, good. You're back. You froze for a second.
Did I freeze? Oh, I don't know where I froze, so I'll just read the last sentence again. There's much to learn from Magadla's capacity to face real differences within the left. And here, I'm not just talking about the familiar generalized PAC, Black consciousness versus ANC memory contestation about the narration of anti-apartheid heroic action. I'm not even also talking about the seemingly easier, although perhaps the recent death of Mangosuthu Buthelezi questions this too, sometimes easier to articulate conflict and violence between parts of the Black left and the Black right. But Magadla goes much further to name and include women's insurrection under the oft-silence violent exchanges between parts of the left anti-apartheid movement, such as the violent altercations between the UDF and Azapo in Port Elizabeth specifically, but also more broadly parts of the Eastern Cape. To navigate terrain fraught with such landmines is no small feat. Yet even with this significantly expanded definition of women's armed struggle and combative forms, Magadla's redefined terrain is cast with astounding conceptual and field definitional clarity. While Guerrillas and Combative Mothers does important work in addressing the erasure of women's insurrectionary work in understandings of South Africa's past and present, its task is not to supplement existing narratives. And here I agree with what Rachel also said of unstruggles to ensure the inclusion of women's experiences within that ambit. Still, Magadla is necessarily forceful in her tracing of the consistent erasure of women combatants in recent and ongoing scholarship, despite significant feminist scholarship that should make this oversight today a near impossibility. There are questions, and perhaps another response can articulate the ways in which this erasure seems less like erasure and more like downright hostility and contempt for women's historic anti-apartheid work, but not here. Magadla's book's task is much more ambitious than supplementation, And in addressing what the book does, I'm going to limit myself to four of what I think are key intervention areas for the sake of time and to enable the exchange we have all come to also be part of. I've already mentioned that Magadla's work here offers a rethinking of the relationship between women and armed anti-apartheid activist forms. Strikingly, she departs from mass feminist, political, scientific, and broadly humanities and social scientific convention in the kind of conversations that brings between political motherhood, here more convention and guerrilla and women, here more specifically what Magadla names combative and protective motherhood. Political motherhood is contested terrain for South African feminists concerned with reading women's political agency in South Africa's past. And while we have now grown accustomed to the enduring and, in my view, still important questions of whether it is accurate to think about all women's collective anti-apartheid radical work as feminist, Magadla adds a different dimension to this already muddy terrain. On the one hand, she analyzes MK women's grappling with the text of motherhood. She spends time unpacking, for example, Thandimu Dise's insistence that women's guerrilla work not be linked too easily to the already patriarchally available trope of women's entry into politics through women, as well as in her discussion, in Magadla's discussion, of the uses of the creative, the specific ways in which MK women confronted the difficulty of definitions of political motherhood, not only through their joining MK, but also through their imaginative, artistic productions. Here she quotes Judy Ann Seidman, who writes of visual artistic work by MK women in these terms, and I think this is, so I'll read the quotation. We argued strongly that our images should present women as soldiers, not solely as mothers and sisters and daughters of the men who did the real fighting. While a good idea in principle, it was hard to generate concrete images based upon visual memories. Here we see the many conflicted and conflictual positions women have with the intersections of motherhood and politics. Keenly invested in representations of framing of the work of women, Several MK and PAC women speak about their involvement in cultural artistic work and producing work for various outfits such as Amandla Cultural Ensemble, Medu, Staff Rider, as intertwined with the kind of fighting work, not as supplementary, not as escape work, but as intertwined with the kind of fighting work that they were doing as guerrilla women in the camps. On the other hand, women who took up combative and protective motherhood in the context of the UDF Azapo violence that Magadla writes about in the Port Elizabeth area, expressly point to understanding that their own strategies and intentions notwithstanding, they will be read under the already available cover of motherhood as safe, even as they are sometimes themselves in other guises when not performing motherhood, recognized as the dangerous insurrectionary women they are by the apartheid state. And so then this assumption of political motherhood by women who themselves problematize it in other guises as one of the resources of doing violent political work. The combative mothers of Boko and Amabuto demonstrate the intersection of political tradition and maternal politics for social change, we are reminded by Magadla. These accounts, Magadla's accounts, provide tangible examples of how motherhood can both be a transformative tool towards intergenerational collective action and a limitation and a prison of not only representation, but of political agency. Magadla writes that when women participated in military operations, they made use of their guerrilla training and manipulated societal assumptions about women's assumed non-combatant status. And this here, I think one of the really powerful contributions is the way in which Magadla, through motherhood, through sexuality, through kind of indexing, dwelling on how MK women spoke about their own negotiations of femininity is quite an important resource, not only in thinking about these women specifically, but also, of course, in our ability to plot and understand the kinds of femininities and gender performance that become possible in the society that these women create, not only in the camps, but post-apartheid in the society that we live in. And one of the questions that I was left with, one of the invitations that I was left with this, and perhaps Siphokazi can speak a little bit about this in her comment, was the relationship. So to what extent this pliability that these women celebrate when they perform, or when they go under cover of protective motherhood or the protective femininity, as some patriarchal assumptions, use these as mask, as a resource against kind of patriarchal assumptions, are able to be or unable to be performed in to the same extent today. And then I want to also, the second really important, or third, my apologies, third really important intervention is in the interrogation of women's violent anger, as when women recognize that they are written as victims. So I suppose in what we can think about as obligatory, the obligation, what has become an obligation for women in MK, in guerrilla struggle, to speak about sexual violation, and the ways in which to speak about sexual violation has, on the one hand, seems to be a demand as a way of thinking about gender in provocative ways and problematizing the armed struggle and problematizing nationalism and liberation movements on the one hand. But on the other hand, this admission, this interrogation then makes it impossible for women to speak about the range of other roles in ways that the violent lashing out is not just a response to the erasure of Black women in the TRC and of exclusion of sexual violence from listing of apartheid crimes, but also a citation of women's agency and articulations of violence by themselves on their own behalf. It references women's heroic violent actions informed, I think, or written by Magadla, as informed in part by feminist rage. This is also a response to very gendered initiating violence. About the TRC, Magadla writes, the process assumed that survivors of apartheid violence readily had the language to articulate their experiences of violence. It assumed that speech, the articulation of violence, ought to precede the healing instead of vice versa. Here then, the difficulty of languaging, how to speak about sexual violence as real and as important, but in ways that does not hyper-visibilize sexual violence and the victimization of women in ways that erase the multiple ways in which the agency was expressed. The difficulty of languaging, which was already hinted at when Magadla, in her framing introduction, here probes the inconsistencies in MK Women's interviews across time, not as cause for dismissal, not as a way to point to how we can think about these narratives as unreliable, but rather as a way of speaking to what is, as a way of highlighting what is speakable and unspeakable then and in the futures they create. And then finally, the book makes a really important intervention in the ways in which we think about women's radical action, combatant women, guerrilla women, as networks of women and networks of families, taking up the mantle of anti-apartheid struggle. Whereas in much scholarship and popular memory, radical women's participation in struggle, armed or otherwise, is often diminished when they join as members of already political active families, with the assumption, much critiqued, for example, by Phyllis Ndandala, who was highly irritated by the assumption often when women joined that they had been radicalized as daughters, wives, and girlfriends who were radicalized by the men they followed. Magadla also complicates the ways in which several family members often join the struggle, sometimes different parts of the armed struggle. And I found the example uses of two particular women combatants from different places quite instructive here. Her discussion of Brenda Badela's joining of armed struggle of MK eventually after her father sought off, as well as Nkosazana Sobantu and her brother, who was involved in the UDF and ANC in PE, three people. Maboniso, who joins after her mother's PECO and sister's heavy involvement and ongoing harassment by police in the midst of UDF-Azabo conflict. And I think in the writing, not shying away from the ways in which multiple members of the family, that sometimes families were highly political and took up arms in the same struggle, in the same movement, and sometimes in disparate movements. Her particular way, I think Magadla offers as a way to write about political families in ways that allows for the distinctiveness of choices that women made and different family members made without the conventional and all too easy exaggerated influence over women that we often see. And then finally, she offers for us the importance of thinking about the varied ways in which women engage in armed combat or enabled it through strategic roles they played, from rural activists who, although not recognized as such currently, were clearly seen as dangerous by apartheid police and state, as clearly evident from the banishments, imprisonments, torture, and prosecutions. Magadla also highlights the many ways in which women made use of patriarchy's blind spots to work successfully as scouts, and to take on strategic roles. Also interrogates the ways in which not reading women in full context obscures the very rich tapestries of women work. We might want to ask, for example, how much harder it might be to read women such as Winnie Madikizela Mandela as mysterious and odd if we take seriously the kinds of material surfaced in multiple interviews by Magadla and others from which she draws, where Madikizela Mandela is readable. Similarly, what does it mean that some aspects of women's activist lives are easier to speak about and in service of what than others? The example of Nondwe Mankahla is one such example because although relatively well known in one type of heroic activist tradition, as a woman who would not testify for the state against other activists, a significant number of whom were women, the MK part of her life is obscured. And we're invited to ask questions about why. I'm intrigued by the use of the creative Siphokazi. At several points, creative texts intervene, frame, or introduce important sections of the book. In some ways, they work like interviews, but more consistently, they work as standalone sources of information rarely commented on. I wondered about this choice in writing the book, and I did so even more so when I read and reread the discussion on the place of the creative in the lives of several MK women, and especially Balegambete's discussion of the creative and the joy it offers her in the middle of an otherwise difficult, although energizing, guerrilla moment. Not as escape, but as an integral part of the political life and moment in her life. I also wondered about what your thoughts are about the availability of, I noticed that the chapters were significantly different in size, given that the face of guerrilla women is often MK. I wondered about whether you could share with us your thoughts about the numbers of women comparatively and the spaces allocated to the different forms of the different positions within armed struggle and combative politics. Thanks.
Gosh, thank you both. Thank you, Pumla. That was just both these fantastic readings, very close readings of your book, Siphokazi. Do you want to respond now? Should we take a few questions? We don't have very much time. We have 20 minutes. And I'm wondering if you mind if we take a few questions and then you can maybe make a comment in response to several points?
Yes, that sounds great. Thanks.
Thanks. So would anyone would like to raise their hand for a question or a comment. And while you're doing that, I'll just underline everything that's been said by pointing out that actually for me as well, Siphokazi, your sort of stretching of the term combatant was really, really useful, particularly as we talk about the war in the townships, but we don't talk about the women in the war in the township as combatants. And I thought that you were doing some extraordinarily important work in expanding that concept. Precious Banda, you would like to say something?
Thank you. It's a great webinar of learning. So last week, actually, I came across your book and enjoyed it. After I was to attend a conference last week that is doing work in memorializing the contributions of women by one NGO. And it brought along freedom fighters who are women from the frontline states and liberation movements in Africa, specifically in Southern Africa. And I came across very important women there, like the first woman general in Angola, Mpela Louise, who's I was meeting her for the first time. Another woman general and from Swapo, I was meeting her for the first time. Another one from Frelimo, who speaks about how actually it is them that taught great men like Samora Machel a lot of things. And from South Africa, there was one woman was in the MK who called herself the first woman sniper and I'm instructor or something like that. And what these women had in common is that it was the first time a young woman like me in the 30s is coming across their stories. And I really wondered, and it resonated more with Magadla's book. So what I've been wondering since then is what therefore do we do into writing these women into existence, in ensuring that as we build a collective memory around the past and as we tell the stories of liberation, then how do we ensure that these women, their stories get to be known, or that women survive or re-emerge from the epistemic erasure that is there now, because it was really said that these great women, their male counterparts, their stories are known, told everywhere worldwide, even kids still know them, but we don't know the women that were side by side with them. What from the view of all panelists can be done practically to ensure that these stories of these great women get to be told and get to be known, even to generations that come after us. Thank you very much, and I still appreciate this platform and the great discussions taking place.
Thank you so much, Precious. Laura Richardson, you had a question.
Hi, Siphokazi. Mine is a really simple question. And it's simply that in some of your articles that you wrote preceding your book, but on work, based on work that you were obviously doing around the book and around the interviews that you'd done, you spoke of guerrilla girls and combatant mothers. And I wondered why the dropping of the word girls. And maybe you explain that in the book, but it's just something that intrigued me. Yeah, that's all.
Thanks, Laura. Kebatlale, do you want to go next? Maybe we'll take one more after you, Kebatlale.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Professor Siphokazi Magadla, for your wonderful book. I do have one question with regards to just the act of tracing women who used different names, and names that we may never know of, names that we may never trace, because just the other day I had a conversation and I was thinking about, or we were both thinking about this notion of how one person in combat or in these spaces of combat will use one name in Angola, but then when they get to Zambia, they'd use a different name. And then when they leave the continent, they'd adopt another name. So what does it then mean to think about these women in context to the idea of names and names that didn't belong to them? And how then do we begin the act of memorializing or even tracing or even historicizing names that we may never know of? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Quite a lot of questions, mostly people wondering how this work can be taken forward, Siphokazi, but maybe you want to now answer some of them.
Oh, thank you so much. These are fantastic questions, and I'm so thankful for Rachel and Pumla's reflections. I'm going to listen to this recording again, and just to take it in. I really, really appreciate this close reading. So I'm not going to be able to cover all of the questions. I hope I've noted them down, but a key question that Rachel raised was around, how do you find the women to begin with? And I remember going to an ANC office, I think it was the one in Gqola, and one male leader told me that no, most of them have passed on. They've either passed on or they don't want to talk. So there was a lot of that, but I a lot of it was really going into the offices. So the specific question about how did I get the women of Porto? So I went to the PAC office in East London, and the councillor there, he took me to Mam Nomvo Boy's house in Amalinda. So I had read about her, of course, in Prodigal Daughters, and so I was very happy to be taken to her house. And when I got there, she had had a stroke in 2009. She couldn't speak, but we sat there for some time and she really wanted to speak. And I remember as I was walking out, she was holding me by the hand. And it's one of the memories I'll never forget. That same councillor told me, why don't you go to Mthatha to speak to the women that were active, that were imprisoned in 63? So that's how I hopped on the bus and went to Mthatha. And it was another PAC man who drove me with his car to Gqola, where these elders had been brought together in one home. And so that's how I found them. And many of them already were elderly. I mean, it's a heartbreaking part of the book, but I have a whole paragraph where I list the many that have since passed on. But so a lot of it is a chase against time. And this is what Ambassador Mtito says in the forward, we are running out of time. So it was that. And then once I managed to get one woman, she would then connect me to others. So finding Sisnomfundiso Kulati in Gqola, for instance, was really a turning point for me, because she linked me to many of the MK women in the Eastern Cape. Catherine Burns had introduced me to Makosa Zanataba in 2012. So it was really through those connections. But in 2012, when I was developing my proposal, I was also observing the oral histories that Janet Cherry and Teresa Edelman were running with the Amabuto, the self-defense unit. And what really haunted me was a story told by one of the women who said she couldn't eat meat for a long time because she had seen too many people being burned to death. So she really is quite key in how she unraveled my idea of what a guerrilla looks like. And so after that, I couldn't go around only looking after MK women. I couldn't go around only looking after APLA women that went to exile. I had to look for women who remained in South Africa and what their experience was. And so maybe as a way to also answer the question about why do I not spend as much time really foregrounding the political differences? I think it is really those early those experiences around how, yes, so that that story, for instance, was quite key in allowing me to pause and listen to the experience, and not so much then the political differences, even though you have one of the mothers, talks quite clearly about how they wore white in Gqeberha, and they wondered where the Azapo women were, and why some of the Azapo young people were not being targeted, So it was a bit of a dance, I want to say, but I think I wanted to really listen to the experiences, but it is a question for me to think about. But in the oral histories of the Amabuto, for instance, a lot of them saw themselves as carrying the mandate of the ANC. So they didn't see the difference, so for them, they were carrying a mandate for a political movement that couldn't operate openly. So that's really my thinking around that question. And then, sorry, I'm going to try. So there was what surprised me. I think maybe what surprised me was the openness of the women. What I saw was that it's not true. It's not true that women were not ready to speak. It seemed to me that women had not been asked. So at once, in the early stages, as the poem "Our Lips No Longer Sealed" shows, it was also at some point early on, it was too soon for women to speak. And then later on, you see that in a way, then women are not asked. So it's those two things are true at once. I sat in a home where one of the elders told me that her son had been shot, in the yard of the home that we were in. And so it's not a surprise, but it is the heaviness that came with the work. And I just found when I was doing the field work that I would come home and just have to bath, and take a shower, so that became part of my ritual. And the photographs, I wish I had more of them. A lot of them really are donations from the veterans themselves. With the ones in Granduli, I wish I'd taken pictures. I lost a phone during the process where I had some of the images, so, but a lot of them was really donations from the veterans. And then, policy implications. I'm part of a project with the Center for Women and Gender Studies at NMU, Professor Babala Gqola, Dr. Thambile Masola, and Professor Puleng Sekhalo at UNISA, where we are doing women's workshops, writing workshops, where more women from PAC, MK, and Azanla are writing about their lives. So we've done 2 workshops. We did one last year, and we had a 5-day workshop during Freedom Day, going to Labor Day. And so we have close to 1,000 pages of handwritten material by these veterans, 16 of them. And our goal is to produce an edited volume, but beyond that is to support the veterans to write full memoirs, because my sense is that we need more memoirs. So I write about Ruth Mantile's memoir as one of the very few by an MK woman. So in a way, through these writing workshops, we're trying to show the Department of Military Veterans the kind of material support that is necessary for women to write about their lives. So Makosa Zanakaba is our workshop leader because she's worked with women veterans in Zimbabwe, in Malawi, women who say, I want to write about my life, but I'm not a writer. So she's given us a framework of the strategies one uses. We have a psychologist on board. So we are trying to figure it out together. And so far it's difficult, but it's also very beautiful. In a way, we are trying to say to the DMV, this is how it can be done. That's one way. And then Professor Gqola, I like this question around the cloak of femininity and how, it's easy to use it in a situation of combat and how it is used today. I want to think about that a bit more, because in some ways, I'm not sure that South Africa today allows for that kind of dynamism. And in some ways, I think the women in the ANC, in the PAC, are quite isolated. And so I don't get a sense of sort of a freshness or new ideas in terms of the women that are staying within these political parties. And I worry, that we might get a president when the political party has really destroyed itself, and the woman might be blamed for that. So I want to think more about that. And of course, I expected from you the question about the use of creative texts. I want to say, in the PhD, I used a couple of Baba's poems, but what really shook me was the publication of Malibongwe and the fact that a couple of the women that I interviewed published poems in this collection, such as Belinda Martin, such as Pumla Gyanki, Alice Tsongo. And so, the publication of the book really invited me to in a way, I was able to think through, the language that women used to make sense of their experience, and the people that some of the text that influenced me is Sister Citizen by Melissa Harris Perry, because the subtitle of her book is really borrowed from Doza Keshange's For Colored Girls, because the subtext of the book is when women choose politics, when being strong is not enough. Black feminist thought, Patricia Hill Collins does that as well, and really as a sociologist using creative texts. But I was nervous about it because I'm not trained, but I also thought, the poems don't belong to the people in literature alone. They belong to all of us to think about. And in a way, I need poetry in my life, and somehow Malibongwe freed me to do that in this work. And then I hope, Precious, I've answered your question around what do we do to ensure that women are not erased, by talking about how this work is continuing beyond this book. And then Laura, dropping the Guerrilla Girls, this I have to credit one of the reviewers who said, what does it mean for you to call these combatants girls, when they said that we are not just women soldiers, we are not she comrades. So I was thinking about that, and I thought it is possible for me to make a point about age, about the fact that many of the women that could be in MK were young, and really they were girls. I could make that point without then making the mistake of infantilizing women. So that's where the decision came from, and I'm really thankful for that reviewer, because she really took me on. I hope I've answered most of the questions.
Amazing. You've done a great job of answering a lot of very difficult questions. So I think there were questions, kind of the questions and the answers strike me as really useful also for the many graduate students who are going to watch this, because it's a methods question, and we shouldn't make it look, the book makes it look so seamless and easy, but it is important to know how much work goes into it. And I'm really fascinated by the life of this book beyond the book, Siphokazi. In fact, the life of the book before the book, and then around the book, and it's an act to me of great service to the project of archiving that still remains so incomplete. So I want to say thank you for all those other activities as well, and to just point out how often it is when you are doing feminist work you are called to do so much more than just be a straightforward scholar. And that, in a way, is what gives us life, but it is also what exhausts us. And to just acknowledge that as well. So I'm going to say thank you to you. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Please buy the book, because that also matters, to buy the book. Thank you, Rachel, for putting the link to Clark's books in the chat. I didn't know that the postage was so reasonable, but fantastic. We should buy from booksellers in the South, as well as buy the books of people in the South. Thank you very much, Siphokazi, for this gift of a book. We are so grateful for it, and we wish you great success with the book, but look forward to the next big thing coming from you. So thank you all. Next week, we are discussing The Blinded City, which is very topical as well, about Johannesburg, the inner city of Johannesburg. We have the author, Matthew Wilhelm Solomon, and in discussion with him, another two amazing discussants, Mpho Matsipa, who's based at Columbia, an urbanist, an urban designer, an architect, and Niren Tolsi, who is a journalist, and like Pumla, a Ruth First scholar, among other things. So thank you all. Please join us, keep joining us, and it's wonderful to be part of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Such nice comments in the chat, Siphokazi. I'm not sure that we should figure out. Yeah, I think you can save the chat. Let me save the chat.
Yes, please save it.
I'm going to save the chat for you so that you can have it for your record. Thank you, Rachel and Pumla too. That was great. I think, it's this kind of critical appreciation that makes intellectual work so rewarding and wonderful. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Pumla, for changing your flight. I feel very lucky. I didn't deserve that.
In the end, I canceled it altogether, because then they just tried to complicate my. I was like, no, we're going to do this in Canada virtually. We'll go to North America.
No, we have to actually bring you here if we can prize you.
I can just come if you invite me. You don't have to.
Oh, well, thank you.
I actually have money to come, but you have to invite me.
Okay, I have money to bring you, and I better do it.
I have money to come see you. So
aren't we planning something for next year anyway? So we'll have to.
Yes, but then you're coming, so it can't be next year. It'll have to be.
Nice.
This is a new problem.
Yeah, next year in Montreal. That's true. We should have Pumla as our keynote speaker. If I had anything to do with choosing the keynote speaker, that would be Belinda's suggestion.
What is CAAL, Canadian
Association of African Studies? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you send me I'm going to find the CFP and see when it is.
It is in, I think it is in June, early June, maybe. Am I right? I think so.
In
Montreal, which is fantastic. Fantastic city.
May?
Yeah, it's May. I will send you the link.
Oh, May.
Thank you. Yes, please send me the link. If it's still open, I'll send something, and then I'll see you there. Maybe. Why not? I've never been to Canada.
Oh, well, I hate to tell you this, but there's a fortress around Canada. So to get a wretched visa, that is the biggest. I
will figure it out.
You can break down any wall, can't you?
I will figure it out.